The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
Siege, we are still picking up the pieces after the third edition of this year's Battle of Ontario took place in Toronto. A season sweep for the Ottawa Senators. And the two Ontario teams feeling very different after that game. Do we want to dive in on the Toronto response first or the Ottawa response first?
Well, it's Monday. Let's start with a little positivity. So why not? The team that's won 6 games in a row, I mean, there's not going to be a lot of controversy to come out of that chat.
No. No, the Ottawa Senators, they look like a playoff team. They played like a playoff team. Their guys are clicking at the right time. That Dylan Cousins trade looks like it's working. Linus Ullmark, he had that weird goalie gaffe where he ended up quoting Steve Dangle, which was really wild to hear in real time. Things are good around this Ottawa Senators team. I know I have my perceptions of this team. I think I thought they were going to make the playoffs from the beginning of the year, but it looks like they're really going to do it now. I'm very curious to know what you think and maybe what some of the other people around the league might think about this team. I'm very curious about outside perception of this year's Ottawa Senators.
Well, I mean, certainly I'm with you. They put themselves in a good spot. What I would say, my observation of the last week or two of the season has been, though, this is a tough time of year for, it feels like a lot of the top teams are kind of scuffling a bit. You know, I see Florida lose a couple games over the weekend. I don't know if Toronto's a top team, but they've obviously gone through, their own struggles of late. And then you see some of these teams surging. And I think Ottawa's ahead of the other ones, but, the Canadians have had a really nice run here of late. Even the Pittsburgh Penguins have gotten hot and gotten back to where maybe if you bend in a certain direction, you can talk yourself into them being in the playoff race. I mean, certainly if they keep winning, you can't ignore that fact. And so I'll give the Senators credit because they've had such a streaky year and the streaks have gone in both directions, but they needed to sort of a push like the one they found over these last couple of weeks. And the points count the same no matter what the circumstances are. And so at some point or another, you got to get the wins. You have to put the points in the standings. And so I'm not saying it by any means as an excuse for those top teams. I'm just observing it feels like the dog days for teams, a lot of teams that are kind of had their playoff spots. They're not officially clinched, but they're in really good position. Whereas, the urgency is really on for those around the bubble. And that's where the Senators have been now by virtue of their 6 straight wins. They've built up a little cushion themselves and they have to push through that. But, when I look at the way they played Saturday and even beyond that, I mean, last week, you look at their team on paper and it's finally kind of gelling on the ice. I mean, there's not a lot of apparent holes to their roster. It's not to say they're the strongest team in the league either, but they've finally got things in a really good spot there. And I think the players that have been around for a long, long time, have got to a point where they're really ready to make an impact and are making an impact on the standings. So, I still don't know what's going to happen because New Jersey, with all the injuries it's had, is sliding back. And they were a team with points in the bank. So I'm not saying they're going to miss the playoffs, but there's a world if they don't, kind of keep pushing forward here. I mean, it's a very strange playoff race in the East. I mean, we've seen Columbus kind of fall off a little bit. Yeah. It just feels like it's going to go right down to the end. But, when we're talking specifically about Ottawa, I mean, this was a needed 6-game win streak or something like that. Because they have built up a little bit of a cushion and have put themselves in position to get there. And then, of course, there's always some confidence to be drawn. I mean, there's, for whatever reason, there's still a geographic rivalry there with Toronto and Ottawa. I mean, it's the two teams haven't really been good at the same time too often in the last 20 odd years. But, right now the Leafs are still a playoff team and the Sens are on the rise and they've beaten them all 3 times this year. I just think there's a little psychological bonus that comes with that. And, as we're talking now, the Battle of Ontario doesn't look as likely as it once did, but, there's still a few more weeks for that maybe to change. And so you can't rule out the possibility we see an Ottawa-Toronto playoff series in which I think the Senators would feel pretty good given how they've matched up head-to-head with the Leafs.
Yeah, in the 3 games that I've seen these two teams play against each other, unless I'm blanking, unless I just had a complete blank moment on one of those games or one of those moments, I can't think of too many times where the Leafs held a firm control over any of those matchups. Like that first game in particular, the Sens won that game 4-0, and they went up in Toronto and they were that team. I don't know why I'm remembering less of when Toronto came into Ottawa, but like Ottawa came out of that a winner, obviously. And then even Saturday night, where I'm so conditioned to seeing this Leafs team work through its offense, have its best offensive players, even if they're not playing well at 5-on-5, be those guys and be dominant and show off that skill and will their team back. Like I still think of that game last season when I was still in Calgary and the Leafs basically won down the power play with a hat trick from Austin Matthews because of the way that they're just so potent offensively. And beyond that Linus Ullmark mistake and a little bit of wizardry from William Nylander on Saturday, I didn't see enough of that. I was very surprised at how that team looked, but I was also impressed at how that Senators team played against them. And you mentioned no real holes. Like, yeah, maybe the defense a little bit. I wonder how it will hold up in a playoff series, or Linus Ullmark has to be the guy, and he's coming off a really wild week himself. But the veterans they've insulated around that team, your David Perrons or your Michael Abadios, for example, like they're playing well with a core that's getting hot at the right time. Claude Giroux also has to be mentioned in that too. Like the Sens are playing well, and it's happening at both ends of the ice. It's a bit of a ramble here, but like I think a little bit more credit needs to be given to the Ottawa Senators before we delve in on why the Leafs are struggling.
For sure. And look, the margins are small in a game like that, and they found the way to get them on the right side. I mean, one thing, and this will veer a little bit into Leafs, but it touches on that game, is the Leafs had the one power play on the night. And that, and I'm not saying this is not a criticism of officials. It's just more a general recognition that you get to this stage of the season, especially when you get to the playoffs. I mean, you could just put it on a graph if you want. There's just fewer power plays in any games. I think the referees are less likely to call infractions. Maybe the stakes are higher too. We'll give the players some credit for, not doing things across the line quite as often. But, with how hot the Leafs power play has been, that hurts them in a game like that because they get the one opportunity, they go 0 for 1. That's part of it's a 3-2 game with an empty net goal. The Leafs, unfortunately, Chris Tanev kicked one into his own net trying to defend a pass on the Senators power play, and the Leafs didn't score on theirs. I mean, that's how fine the margins can get in these games. But you know what? That's playoff hockey too. I mean, you see the odd playoff game that ends 7-4, but more often than not, they're 2-1, 3-2 type of games, maybe 3-1 with an empty netter. You understand the point. I mean, it's tight. It's not a lot for even the star players. You look for those players to make their mark on the game in the small moments that get presented to them. And Ottawa's found a way to do that. And I do think it builds some confidence as they go down the stretch because, generally speaking, teams that finish the season well, and I mean the next 15 games too, not just what we've seen now. Those are the teams that usually have success in the playoffs. Like it's hard for teams if they're scuffling to put it just to find all the aspects of their games. I mean, the one thing I was thinking about hockey, I don't know why I had this thought the other day. It's like there's so many small components involved with a team, right? We could focus on, defensive structure. We could focus on goaltending specifically. We could focus on a power play or a penalty kill. Like you can get into all these things. Like it's rarely one issue when a team's going poorly. I mean, sometimes it is. If your goaltender can't make a save, doesn't really matter what everyone else is doing around that person because there's going to be shots on goal unless it's the Boston Tampa game on the weekend. There was a whole period without a shot for the Bruins. But generally speaking, I mean, you're gonna need all the components going, and it just feels like the Senators have some of that confidence building in all the sort of in each area of the game. I mean, on any given night, it could be Ullmark's night where he makes 40 plus saves. He makes that crazy stop that you saw the highlights on. But then, against the Leafs, it was a much tighter game. Actually, both sides. I mean, that the shot totals weren't off the charts. It wasn't like high danger rush chances. But they still find a way to win. And to me, that's the formula every team is trying to get itself to. The discussion on the Leafs side right now for sure is about try to find their best playoff game. Obviously they still need to win games because the standings have gotten a lot closer of late, but more than anything, I think they need to find their confidence in those games and their execution, and neither appears to be there right now for obvious reasons. They've lost 5 of 6, and the top players in particular haven't been doing what they normally do enough, and they've had a couple tough goaltending outings along the way too. Like again, it becomes a little bit of everything. So anyway, you had a long ramble question. I had a long ramble answer. Hopefully there's some truth to be found in there, but I do give the Senators credit. I think they've got to a point where they should be a playoff team. Honestly, I mean, this was the expectation and the point. And you just see their younger players, I think, making more impact on the game. And then obviously it was a big decision to get Allmark, to sign him to the contract they did. And they're starting to see, as they've gotten into the season, the dividends of that. Once he got healthy and got his feet under him, I mean, clearly he's been a difference maker.
Okay, let's get into the Leafs proper here. When you see Steve Dangle, have one of his, his usual loud LFRs where there's genuine anger and passion, but of course, genuine anger and maybe even other concern from fans as well. At this point in the season, I think it's justified. What do you see it as?
Yeah, I'm with you. Like sometimes when we go through this exercise with a team like the Leafs in November, when they have a bad week in November and everyone freaks out, but then generally I'm like, okay, guys, do we really have to pretend this 1 week in November is that big a deal? Well, now we're in mid-March, right? We're basically a month and a couple days from the start of the playoffs. And it's not clicking for Toronto. Obviously, the coaching staff's trying a lot of different things. You're seeing, I mean, they blended the lines to start that Senators game. Then in game, there was a lot of changes. Like they don't have any cohesion to their performance right now. And I think that there is genuine concern, about Austin Matthews' health. Clearly he's not been the same player who threatened to score. This time last year we were saying, could Austin Matthews get to 70 goals? And he got almost there. He got to 69 before falling just short. Now it's like, can he get to 30 goals? Because he's missed games this season, and he hasn't been scoring goals at the same rate that he had, frankly, ever. This is the lowest conversion rate of his career to this point. And we know he's been dealing with a series of injuries through the season. So, not to put it all on his shoulders, but I do think that the concern or the panic time is about right. And the optimist will sit here and say, okay, you got 15, 16 games to basically play better, to quiet all that concern. Or if it keeps going in the wrong direction here, I mean, they got another tough week this week with a series of games, a back-to-back. If you keep losing kind of in the manner they have been, I mean, the noise is only going to grow louder. And, I think that I'll say this isn't just a fan-driven reaction or media-driven reaction. I mean, my sense is there's some concern around the team that they just recognize they're not playing well enough and that they've deserved a lot of the results here. I mean, that's the thing is sometimes you lose games and just weird shit happens and you're like, okay, but if we take away the emotion of it, we're deserving to, like, they're just not outplaying teams consistently enough. Even when they won a game in Utah, for example, last week on the road, I mean, it was a night where they found a way to win. And again, those points count and you don't have to apologize when you win a game you don't dominate. But, for a team like the Leafs, I think they need to be playing better. And, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that they're not alone in the league. A lot of the best teams aren't really firing right now. But, the time this is like, there's no more like, yeah, but we'll get there eventually time, right? This is you're the exam period almost, right? So this isn't, put off the homework another night or two and we'll see what happens. So, the intensity, like the pressure is really ratcheted up around this group. And there's a lot of stuff, like we don't have to go down all the doorways, but even just some of the uncertainty with Marner, with Tavares, with the future of like this does feel different. I feel like we've said this before, Charles, but this really does feel different entering this stretch run that this team this is the last chance for sure that they know they're going to be together. The the core players that has been there. It's their last certain chance to get it right. And right now they're not right. And they've got a month to kind of be ready for the real test again, or who knows what the next few months will look like in Toronto.
Okay, there's one Leafs question I have, and you're right. There are tons of doorways. The Marner one we've gone through ad nauseum these last couple of days. I don't get the sense right now, and please tell me if I'm wrong, I don't get the sense right now that this Leafs team has an identity. How often in your NHL career looking at teams have you seen teams who might not have an identity 66 or 68 games into a season find success beyond? Like, I don't know if that's something that happens frequently.
No, but they ripped through December, and at that time we were talking about how they had grown this identity, with Craig Berube, and that they were basically, I mean, what their identity is right now is they still have those high-powered offensive players, but they are not a high-powered offensive team. When you look at their shot metrics, when you look at the way they're generating offense, it's not happening for them to the degree that it used to. Now, I think that was an intentional decision made internally about trying to be more predictable defensively, to not, to find a way to maximize those weapons. But I'm with you that it's probably not happening. Now, the fact they do have one of the league's best power plays, like that should be, if you have a team built the way the Leafs are built, that should be part of your identity. And then you have to find a way to drop penalty power plays. Like, you have to make use of that. But I'll buy your general point. I mean, it's been weird too. Like, you make 2 trades at the deadline. This might be another factor I haven't thought through, but for some of the other teams that I said that aren't like clicking yet. Like, I think some teams are integrating new players and not just like sort of players in key positions. Like Brandon Carlo, for example, looks like he's going to play a lot of minutes as a Leaf. Like, he's not just someone you're putting in a third pairing and using, 12 to 15 minutes a night. It just hasn't clicked, but I'm still not going to sit here and say they can't do it. It just, right. It doesn't look good right now. I mean, and there's not a lot of reason for optimism. And I think that's why you're seeing the reaction you're seeing. And as I say, like, it's being felt internally too. Like, they're at the critical point of the season, and it's just, they haven't found that gear yet. And so if you're going to be optimistic, you're going to say, well, eventually these guys aren't going to keep, producing like this, but maybe they are, right? Like, maybe it's just not their year. And that's kind of what they're battling through right now. Maybe it's a good thing to have all these games, frankly, because if it starts to turn, you kind of deal, put a lot of the noise and stuff aside. But yeah, it's never boring in Toronto, my friend.
No. Calgary, Toronto on Monday night. The Leafs have an opportunity to change their fortunes. The Flames on the other side, obviously fine for their playoff lives. I'm going to try to relax and and save my anticipation for Montreal, Ottawa on Tuesday, because that is going to be a very fascinating matchup with the Canadiens fighting for their playoff lives and the Ottawa looking to extend their winning streak. Those are 2 really hot teams. They've been really hot since the Four Nations face-off ended. Montreal and Ottawa, I mean.
Yeah, and I don't know if the Canadiens can keep their push on, because they've made kind of their surge and they're still not quite in the playoff line. But, this is a fun time of year. Like, even out West, where it didn't look like we were going to necessarily have the same degree of playoff races, then you get St. Louis and Utah both getting pretty hot. And all of a sudden it's a pretty compressed race there. And so, we're in that point of the schedule where, for all those teams on the playoff line, like, every night you're living and dying with the out of town results, with your own team's games. I mean, this is the fun part of the season. What's interesting to me about the West, just looking at the standings this morning, is Minnesota, Vancouver, as we're recording, have the last 2 wildcard spots locked down, both with the negative goal differential. St. Louis is next on the other side of the line. They're even. But I mean, basically all the teams, none of the teams in the mix there have been dominant this year. It's basically like, who can get hot right now? Like, I'm not sure there's a whole lot between those teams. Obviously, Minnesota's big issue too is they're down Eriksson Ek and Kaprizov, both been out long-term with injury, and they can't score. And read our athletic colleague Michael Russo's story on Saturday, did not paint a very rosy picture of what's going on in Minnesota now, where they're just struggling to create much. And so I don't think it's good not to lose sight of when you think of the league that just there's a lot of chaos at a lot of places because, a lot of teams have pretty high hopes. I guess this is the one good thing about parity. I hate that word, and I kind of, it becomes almost a meme or a trope how often it gets kicked around the NHL. But the one cool thing about the NHL is I think you can build a case for quite a number of teams at least having long playoff runs. I mean, you get down to a smaller number when we talk about the teams that I think are legit cup, kind of like cup teams, potential cup teams. But, there's a lot of, there's more expectations to go around than there is, spots for success. And so that does create kind of the tension we're seeing game by game these days.
This episode of the Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, I don't bounce back the next day like I used to. I have to make a choice. It's either I'm going to have a great night or I'm going to have a great next day. That is, until I discovered pre-alcohol. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. So just remember to make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Every time I have pre-alcohol before drinks, I notice a difference the next day. Even after a night out, I can confidently plan on working, maybe even doing this podcast, without worry. This March Madness, don't let anything sideline your celebrations. Grab pre-alcohol before you go out and be ready to cheer on your team all day and all night long. Go to zbiotics.com/CJS. Learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use CJS at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money. No questions asked. Product only available in the United States. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/CJS and use the code CJS at checkout for 15% off.
I think this is a great segue to look into the Central Division because Dallas and Colorado, there's the big story with that one Dallas Stars player, which we'll get to in a second. But Dallas and Colorado just neck and neck in points. Colorado's been playing really well, 8 wins in their last 10. They've really heated up at the right time. And there's that likelihood that we'll see these two teams play against each other in the playoffs. And there's reason for either of them to be in the Cup final and represent the West this year. I get Winnipeg exists and they still look like a favorite, but Dallas and Colorado, they have their high hopes too. And I'm very fascinated to see how those two teams figure themselves out in that division. Very fascinating.
Well, we can't discount the advantage. I mean, it looks like a near certainty at this point that Winnipeg will win the Central in the regular season, so that sets up Dallas, Colorado. I don't think that we can overlook the fact that Winnipeg, look, there's no easy playoff series necessarily, but the fact Winnipeg could get an easier series in round one, and then those two teams, go to battle for potentially 7 games and whatever that entails, like that could end up being an advantage for the Jets. And frankly, that's that. Like I hate this divisional playoff format, so I don't want to go open that door again too much. But I will say that there should be an advantage for the teams that are the best teams over 82 games. They should have some kind of advantage. Like that would be the point of a whole regular season is making their playoff path a little easier, or a little, less murky. And so, it's funny. I had a fan. I did a mailbag for The Athletic that went up on Monday morning. Someone asked me to rank the divisions, which was a really tough exercise. But I ended up ranking the Central first as the toughest, knowing full well that there are teams at the bottom of the Central that are not tough. But I just think having Winnipeg, Dallas, and Colorado, like those to me are 3 teams that are 3 teams with legitimate cup aspirations, all in the same division. That put me ahead for them. I don't think there's another division quite with that. I mean, you might argue the Pacific if you still think Vegas, Edmonton, and LA are all potential cup teams. I think in the Metro, it's probably just Washington and Carolina at this point that I would put in that bucket. And honestly, The Atlantic, I still think is a tough division, but Florida and Tampa, I mean, the Leafs are even with Tampa right now in same games played. But I don't know if the Leafs are there. Like, anyway, it's a tough exercise. Like, what is the toughest division? But to me, Colorado being the third seed as we speak right now is pretty wild in that division, given the way those teams loaded up, all the assets they traded away to be the best versions of themselves. And then obviously the performance on the ice. I mean, you got a plus 81 goal differential for Winnipeg, plus 51 for Dallas, and plus 31 for Colorado. I mean, three dominant teams all together. And maybe I'm going to invalidate the things I don't like about the divisional series and saying, well, isn't it kind of crazy or cool that you're going to see the Stars and Avalanche in round one? I mean, forget even the Mikko Rantanen aspect of that, which is not insignificant. I mean, just seeing two teams that could play. It's actually what I don't like about the divisional playoff format is you have two of the absolute best teams in the West who also have had good regular seasons. They're going to play in round one. It just seems strange to me. Like that to me is a second round matchup if you do a 1-8 kind of format.
I was trying to figure out. I just put the teams through 1-8. If you're curious about it, before we get to Mikko Rantanen, or I could move on. But if we did get a 1-8 in the West, you'd get if the playoffs start today, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Dallas, Minnesota, Vegas, LA, Colorado, Edmonton. Those would be your playoff matchups. So I think it'd be a little bit more.
That's more fair. There's just no way around that being more fair.
Yeah, like you don't get Dallas and Colorado knocking each other out in round one. We're all going to watch it, but like, man, at least there's a better
scenario
chance for one of those
you
teams to
just
go
laid
through.
out. I'm not saying it would happen for sure, but there's a possibility then of all of Winnipeg, Dallas, and Colorado winning round one, and then obviously they meet. You know, two of those teams would meet in round two. Like I just think that's a little bit more fair because we've seen this. We've just seen this enough in various divisions where there's a disparity in a conference. And anyway, there's no easy path to the Stanley Cup. No team flukes its way there. But I think the divisional playoff format creates more wonky, weird things than it solves. But the league thinks it's good for rivalries. Here's another one: Edmonton and LA are likely to meet again in the first round.
Yeah.
We consider them rivals. Like, I don't think we do, even though like they're playing every year in round one.
I mean, it's not a rivalry if you keep losing in the rivalry. That's how I feel about rivalries. In LA, unless they win this year, if that happens, then we could talk about it a little differently. And maybe they have a chance this year. Anyway, we should get to Mikko Rantanen and the fallout from that. We could talk about the 1-8 format. Like, we could do an entire episode on the 1-8 format. I know we can because we both have feelings on that. But we should get to Mikko Rantanen and how he discussed the fallout.
One quick second, though, just for fun.
Go off. Okay, sure. Why not?
1, 2, 3, 4. I'm sorting by points percentage to be fair. So
sure.
As of right now in the East, in a 1-8 format, just food for thought, you would have Washington, Montreal, Carolina, New Jersey, Florida, Ottawa, and Tampa, Toronto.
I mean, I like those matchups. Personally, I like the idea of going to Florida for a playoff series for travel.
A Kachuk Brothers series.
I'm telling you,
might get tired of writing with the Kachucks, but I mean, it would that would be the billing of that series.
I mean, I haven't had the opportunity to properly cover Kachuk before this year, so I'll exhaust that as much as I can. If it comes to that, I have no problem with that Ottawa, Florida series. If it comes to that, a Battle of Ontario would feed families, as I've said before, but Ottawa, Florida would make a ton of sense. Anyway, we should get to Mikko Rantanen.
Mikko Rantanen.
Let's do. Yes. Plays against his former team, the Colorado Avalanche, over the weekend. Spoke to reporters a little more about that situation. Let me just read one big quote from his press conference. 6 weeks before the deadline, we were still negotiating at that point, and I felt at that time I needed to go talk to the front office, which I did face to face. I told them I'll be flexible and I want to play here for a long time. Then a couple days later, they traded me. I heard about something that this was a family decision. This is another quote. That was not true at all. It was a hockey decision. At the end of the day, my hockey career, my family will come wherever I want to go. So I want to correct that one too. It was a hockey decision and nothing else. What say you about Mikko Rantanen's comments on how things played out with the Colorado Avalanche?
I don't know if you've ever had a friend that went through like a messy breakup, or if you've been through one yourself or something like that. But generally when you have that kind of situation and then you're still talking about it way after the fact, like at a certain point, you know, each side is going to have their own version of the truth. Mm-hmm. And they might not meet in alignment ever. And I don't know how productive it is. I mean, look, I'll give Mikko Rantanen credit. Obviously, there's still tremendous interest in this story. There's interest in his situation. He's playing his former team for the first time. Like, good for him for standing in and taking questions and trying to share his side of things. But, you know, I don't know that it serves him at this point. I mean, look, he's married to someone else now. That's just the facts of it. I think if we want to, like, my understanding of the situation, quite honestly, is the Avalanche were worried that they wouldn't be able to sign him. They were worried about where the number would go. And they made a decision to get assets back rather than risk losing him for nothing. Now, that's a fair way for them to feel too, because while Mikko Rantanen might have had it in his mind, I was always going to sign there. Like, at the negotiating table, there's some high stakes business involved. And mm-hmm. I'm guessing that was never necessarily communicated exactly that way, right? Because that's part of the negotiation. And so, I don't think either party did anything wrong in this case. The Avalanche took the opportunity to trade a guy that they could get assets back for, rather than be in the situation that the Leafs are with Mitch Marner, where he might just walk out the door even if they want to sign him. And even while he's saying he wants to stay. So, to me, it's just, it's business. I'm happy that, I guess it's good for us if there's all this chaos around, but it just sort of, when I was reading those quotes over the weekend, I was thinking, this isn't going to change anyone's view, really. I think people are going to fall where they fall. He was a great Avalanche player. He helped them win a Stanley Cup. And, now he's on a team that he's going to have a chance to win more Stanley Cups, plural, because I don't see Dallas fading anytime in the near future. And obviously he got his bag too. So I sort of feel like it worked out in a sense. And, I guess the problem if you're Mikko Rantanen, right? A lot of people have been talking about this for the 6 weeks, and he's probably seeing lots of stuff out there. Like, I don't know what all of that's been said or how it's been portrayed, but he's probably seeing it portrayed in ways he doesn't like. And that's why he's trying to clarify the record. But if I was giving him PR advice, I would just say at this point, there's not a lot of upside in you continuing to go into this. Cause I think it's pretty clear you were involved in a negotiation that wasn't getting any traction. Rantanen felt he still had time, of course. And the Avalanche made a big decision. And they didn't give him forewarning. They just said, they didn't give him hey, you have to be signed by this date or we're trading you. They just traded him. But that was always a possibility, right? Like, I'll say this too, when you go into any negotiation, you have to be aware of kind of like what you have as a strength in your pocket, like the positive things you can put on the table. You also have to be cognizant of your weaknesses, of the things that they could say against you or do against you in this case. So it was a high stakes game. Brad Marchand, we talked about him last episode. He had a high stakes negotiation, a little different stakes than Rantanen just because of where he's at in his career. But, in both cases, they didn't sign where they were trying to sign, and the teams had to make a call on them. I think there's a lot of parallels in that. And it undermines what we kind of all know to be true, but you forget sometimes there's not a lot of loyalty in this business, right? And there can't afford to be, because the same way I'm saying the Avalanche maybe didn't have a ton of loyalty in the end to Rantanen, that they were concerned about paying him what he thought his market value was, knowing they're going to have a Makar contract on the horizon, that McKinnon, he's already one of the top paid players in the league. There isn't a lot of loyalty to that front office. If they bungle that negotiation, if they pay him too much, if the team stinks and they don't have any cap space, guess who gets fired then? The same guy that just traded Rantanen out of town. So there's not loyalty in the business broadly. And so that creates these circumstances. And, at the end of the day, now Rantanen's he scores a goal in that game. Now he's going to be in the middle of the craziest playoff series of his life, I think, in a month's time. Just because it's so soon after all this has happened, he's going to be such a big part of what Dallas is trying to do. Those two teams met last year in a crazy series as it was, but now one of the absolute forces has been switched sides. I mean, this is what great sporting moments and narratives are built on. And maybe if there's some bad feelings left over, it's not the worst thing because that could fuel performance too.
Considering the possibility of a Stars Avalanche playoff series, isn't it better that Mikko handles it now compared to, ahead of game one of the playoff series where, yes, you're going to have Dallas and Colorado media, but there's obviously going to be more of a national focus coming in. Whether, say, for example, in a world where you get sent to that series or Greg Wyshynski or an Emily Kaplan from ESPN, for example, like that spotlight, shines a little brighter in a moment like that. So I'm just wondering, like, is it better that Mikko handled it now where, yeah, it's the first game back against your former team versus just saying, you know what, this doesn't serve me to talk about it now, and then you're still getting pestered with it ahead of the playoffs?
I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, but that's definitely a benefit because he can credibly now say, look, guys, I've already addressed this. And then if anyone needs to write about it, which they will, they can go, well, he said on, March 15th, this is what he said about it. You know what I mean? And you have his quote and you have his version of events there. And so I hadn't thought of that and I don't even know if that was part of his kind of reasoning. I think he's just an honest guy. Like at the end of the day, I do think that this isn't coming. It's coming from a good place. I think, it's a city he loved. It's a team he loved. It was a place he was hoping to stay, and didn't work out for him. And now he's getting questions about it. And I think he's just telling his side of the story. But the point is there is another side of the story. And I don't think management will ever get too honest publicly about that at this point, because it's, as I say, it doesn't serve anyone other than feeds the beast here on the media side of things.
Yeah, that story has definitely fed us over the last couple of weeks. But yeah, I'm sure we will end up talking about that a lot more. There's actually just one thing I just have to say. And I know I've said it before, but like, man, if I'm an Avs fan and I see that contract number and I get state taxes are a thing, but man, just a little frustrating. I would still be frustrated if I was an Avs fan that $96 million is what Rantanen signed for in Dallas. And again, state taxes, no state taxes in Dallas and in Texas. I get it, but just like, man, like,
but the last Avalanche offer was $11.65 million.
Yeah.
So the Avalanche didn't offer him $96 million.
Yeah.
So he still got more money than was now Carolina offered more when he was there briefly. But I'm just saying, if you're talking about from the Colorado end, the Avalanche never got to 8 times 12. And then they traded him. So you're right. It's a mystery door. It's like we'll never know. Like, had they offered him 8 times 12, would he have taken it at that time? There's an argument that says he wouldn't have. He would be thinking, hey, it's only January 20th and they're already offering me 8 times 12. That means their real number is 8 times 12.5 or whatever. I think the biggest thing there, right, is McKinnon's 12.6, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. Like, I think there was kind of an internal cap situation going on. And there was some question whether he'd get there. I mean, look, this is, I still think the team didn't necessarily make a bad call because he held once it got on the other side of the trade deadline, he held all the leverage. Once they couldn't trade him, then he could sign or not. He could give them deadlines. He could offer, he always had the ability to go to July 1st and be totally free and they wouldn't be able to get anything for him. So, the team had to make a hard call there, but from what we know, even a team like the Leafs had to think about that with Marner, but they just couldn't. Marner held because he had the full no move. He had all the power even before the deadline. But it's, contracts are about what you produce, but they're also about who has leverage. And Mikko didn't have quite as much leverage as someone like Marner does going into his deal just because of that no movement clause.
Okay, we'll table the Rantanen story for now, and I'll get to one final one before we wrap up here. Pierre LeBrun reporting on this a couple of days ago, the possibility of an 84-game season. The NHL and the NHLPA could discuss that with the likelihood of shortening the preseason. There's another note, I'll get to that too, but just the idea that the 82 games we have now not enough. We could just add 2 more at the expense of the preseason. What say you on that, Siege?
Well, it makes sense this is all against the backdrop that there's a collective bargaining agreement discussions going on. A league does not make that kind of change without both the players and the owners having to sign off on it. And, obviously right now those sides are engaged on, putting together what the NHL is going to look like moving forward after this new agreement takes effect. And so there's been a lot of focus on scheduling. Some of that focus was, could we end the playoffs sooner? Might we get the Stanley Cup handed out sooner? Right now, that doesn't look likely, but there has at least been some thought around that. I think, this year, none of us minded. And as we look back, the fact that a Four Nations break this year, that wasn't a bad thing because that Four Nations tournament was awesome. But, one of the bad results of that or challenging results of that is some teams are looking at their schedules and going like, this is so punishing on the players. Is there ways to build in more time? I mean, every league kind of has a giant Rubik's Cube of number of days, number of events they have to have, and they're trying to make it make sense and fit together. And so I think that those discussions are happening at this stage. Look, we've seen in the past, like coming out of, and I know COVID was its own thing, but going into the COVID playoffs, there was one preseason or one exhibition game played by every team before they jumped into that playoff tournament. So, right now, teams have 6 to 8 exhibition games. And obviously they use those games, especially early on. You get your draft picks. It can be a reward for players further down the organization. But I don't know that there's a practical need for that many games in terms of players being ready to play the season, just because these guys are in such great shape. And so, what's being contemplated now, obviously, if you add more games, that's more tickets to sell, more games to advertise, more revenue into the system at the expense of losing some of the preseason and training camp time. I don't think it's actually that terrible of a trade-off. I have to see where it ends up, but we've seen the NFL go to 17 games from 16 in recent years. Like this is, and we've actually, it was a brief period in time, Julian, but there was an 84 game regular season in the 90s, I believe, maybe 1 or 2 of them anyway. And so from a revenue standpoint, which I think the players and the owners are focused on, it makes sense. And as long as you just get that, I hate exhibition games. So as long as you get that number of exhibition games way down, you're not necessarily, my point is, I guess they're not necessarily adding time to the season. They're just taking away from the preseason and extending the regular season by a couple days. And there's a financial reason to do so. So that's the why it's happening, or why those discussions are going on. And at the same time, the discussions going on and starting the season a little sooner, and then maybe ending it maybe a little sooner. I don't know. That's a tough call for the league, because as much as I personally think it'd be great to have a September to May season, I say that knowing that September is a hard month in a lot of places. The NFL gets going. It's the last month of the baseball regular season heading into the playoffs. It can be a hard time for hockey. Like if hockey starts then, there'll be some markets where you'll be like, what, we have a hockey team? What's going on? Right? Like, yeah. We don't care about the Dallas Stars. What about the Dallas Cowboys? And the Texas Rangers are pushing for a playoff spot and this and that. So, I'm sympathetic to that challenge. And then the other flip side too, last year, the Game 7 of the Cup final, was it June 23rd, I believe? It was late, but the ratings for that series, Florida-Edmonton, weren't hampered by hockey being played that deep into June either. So I think the league is wrestling, and the players are wrestling with what makes the most sense to maximize money, to try to have the demands on the athletes be managed better. And, that's kind of what that conversation centers around. And I would say it seems likely we end up with 84 games just because there's money to be made, man.
Yeah, you're right. Like whenever I see fans argue for fewer games, like a shortened schedule, it's one of those things where, like, once you've opened the tube of toothpaste, like, you can't put toothpaste back. Like, yeah, you're never going to hear an owner in any professional sport argue for fewer games and argue for fewer opportunities to make money at the gate. Like, that's not going to happen. We're not going to see a 60-game season. Well,
you could say, hey, let's take it down to, let's even just take 8 games off. Well, then they might say, okay, let's take 10% of your salary off too. Because 8 out of 82 is almost 10%. So like, who wants to give up 10% of their salary? I mean, the players, people might not realize this. Players in the NHL only get paid for their time in the regular season. There are playoff bonuses that go to the teams that play into the spring, so players get some money from that. But a contract is really about your services from the start, day one of camp through the end of the regular season that is required to be delivered to be paid. And so anytime you take off is basically reducing the money into the system, and it's reducing everyone's paycheck. And, no matter what line of work you in, no matter how much money you have, most people don't like seeing the number go down on what they make. That's just, let's call that a truism.
One more thing from you, Siege. What about the possibility of us not having an all-star game next year in 2026, just ahead of the Olympic Games in Milan? Like, you mentioned the Four Nations break. Like, I don't know if I ever want to see an all-star game ever again. Like, if I have to choose between the Four Nations and an all-star, come on. Like, and I think other leagues should be looking at that example too.
Sure. Well, let's look at while the Four Nations tournament was going on, what was happening in the NBA, the All-Star weekend, and it was getting panned everywhere by participants,
awful,
by the media.
You didn't watch it. I know you didn't watch it, but like, it was awful. That whole, you know what? We don't have a whole show for that. It was bad.
Right. And so what's happening now is the league is having internal discussions. I mean, they're buoyed, as they should be, by the success of Four Nations. I think that they're talking about future ways. Obviously, they've already been trying to formulate a longer term schedule internationally, but they're looking at, like, does this make sense? The time has already been, they also have to finalize next year's schedule here in the pretty near term. They're well down the road for planning for that, but that time was allotted off. I mean, the Islanders have been awarded the 2026 All-Star game. As of this moment, there is an All-Star game in Long Island on Long Island, and then everyone's due that's going to the Olympics to fly over on charters to Milan. But there's a chance that gets taken away, I think, because the league understands All-Star games broadly are not playing well across sports. The NHL All-Star game is going to look nothing nearly as appealing. It would just be impossible to recreate anything like the Four Nations. And so I don't know what the financial implications of that are. When I was talking about the money, the financial aspect of the games played, the number of games in a season decision, it goes the other way on an All-Star game. But there won't be many tiers. I just think it would be tough. I will say this for the Islanders to have an event taken away, the one that, they've sold tickets to, have been promoting among their own fans. I don't know how they would navigate that issue if they ever got to a point where they're ready to wipe it out. But the fact it's being even discussed as a possibility is notable, because I think the NHL recognizes it really hit on something special with Four Nations. And, it might be the opposite of that should they do an All-Star game right before an Olympic tournament next year.
Yeah, we don't need it. I know I don't need it. Anyway, before we actually let you go, I know we've gone through so much today. You're in Florida. I could tell by the beautiful background. We don't get any ambient noises like we heard last week, but you look like you're in a really nice spot in Florida for the NHL GM meetings. What do you expect to hear? What do you expect to be discussed this week?
I think coaches' challenges probably going to be the most interesting topic to fans, to the media. Really the GM's meeting is about getting together the GMs and then going through a lot of trends the league has identified, the hockey operations department, through the season. And this is where rule changes or tweaks come from. But I think, not necessarily forecasting that there will be a change, but, coaches' challenges, I still think, are a bit of a hot button topic. You might have saw a goal taken back on the weekend in a Montreal, Florida game where there didn't appear to be a ton of interference with the goaltender, but it came back. I think that they're going to show GMs these clips and they'll go around the room and just do a vote. Like, not just that clip in particular, but others that have happened this season to see if the standard needs to be changed. And the reason I think that's so important is we are only a month from the playoffs. So what the direction is, what the vibe is, are they getting this right? Is there perhaps longer term rule changes that need to be considered with challenges? I think challenges are potentially the most controversial thing. I mean, look, we just played that whole Four Nations tournament. There wasn't one goal challenge in the tournament. So we didn't have controversy there. Last year's Cup final had one goal review. In it was an offside play, if you remember, a game in Edmonton, but it didn't end up. I mean, it had an impact on that game, I suppose, but didn't impact the outcome of the series. But at some point in time, it could be game 7 of a final, and it could be a 4-4 game. It's the most exciting game 7 we've ever seen instead of a 1-1 game. And something happens in the last minute on a goal, and it could be something that goes down in history, kind of like the Brett Hull goal in 1999 for a generation. I'll tell you this is unrelated to what you asked. There's already a little bit of discussion, not even a little, there's a lot of discussion going on behind the scenes with what happens on Alex Ovechkin's goal when he sets the record. Like, what happens if Tom Wilson is on the edge of the crease bumping the goalie as that goal goes in? But, can they take, how do they treat that? Do they take that moment back? I mean, you can't take that moment back, right? Because when he scores the goal that sets the record, and it could happen still this season on the trend Ovechkin's on, everybody piles off the bench and goes crazy. Imagine they're like, oh, wait, it's being challenged for goalie interference. And it's a really, it's not an obvious one. We're not talking about a player sitting on the goalie. We're talking about a small bump or something. That's already in the league's mind. And so to me, what they say, what comes out about how they're viewing challenges, goaltender interferences, all those things, I think is going to be the most interesting potential for me. The other is the Four Nations tournament. There was some new rules introduced. We saw a 10-minute 3-on-3 overtime at that event, and the Canada-Sweden game in particular, I think it was ended around 6:16, but it went more than 5 minutes. Does the NHL renew that discussion? Do the GMs want to maybe extend the length of overtime just to reduce the number of shootouts even more than they're already getting reduced? So those are maybe two things on my list heading in. But we got 3 days of meetings here before we record again to see where things go. But I wouldn't say, I think the game generally is in a pretty good spot. So this is far more about just reviewing these kinds of things around the margins to see if anything needs to be tweaked or cleaned up.
Alexander Ovechkin scoring a goal and having it taken back by a challenge is something I'm horrified by that thought. And not even just goal interference. Imagine if it's like an offside challenge or something. Oh my God, it'd be so infuriating. Oh, I'd be so infuriated. Oh my God.
I mean, I can tell you there are people at the league, it's like keeping them up at night right now because it's getting so close, right? He's under 10 goals right now from setting the record. And, as it gets even closer, like the focus on those games will grow. Eventually, in the next couple of weeks, presumably, you're going to have Wayne Gretzky and Gary Bettman among those traveling to every game. Like, the anticipation is going to grow and grow and grow. And you get to that moment and it could expose one of the cracks, potentially you might call it a crack in the current rules of the game or things that people don't like. And so anyway, I'm not trying to create the doomsday. I'm just letting you know though, that it's already being discussed because I think we could all agree a moment like that, you don't want it to be interrupted. You don't want it to be a 4-minute challenge to see if it actually counts or not.
Especially if you have Wayne Gretzky and Gary Bettman in the building. I could just imagine that whole time if I'm working for like Sportsnet or some production company in the truck, you're panning back and forth between the refs and what Gary Bettman is doing in his owner's box.
I guess the counterpoint is maybe it would add a little extra drama even, but
sure.
I can tell you for sure the NHL doesn't want that drama. They're hoping it's a clean goal whenever it comes, that there's no controversy, that there's no discussion other than, wow, this guy now has more goals than anyone else who's ever played in the NHL.
Yeah. And when that storyline happens, we'll be talking about that too. Normally we do
close. It's getting close. It's a sprint.
I know. And it looks like, well, I think you said April 2nd or April 4th is your guess as to when that record would be broken. I have to double check that. But I think you projected
if it remains in the window, then we definitely have to get that. We have to get an audio check on that because CJ Damas appeared.
Love CJ Damas. CJ Damas or Chris Damas. Anyway, we could workshop that, but I like CJ Damas. Normally we would do Ask CJ on Monday. Since we did it on Thursday, we're just going to reset for the weekend. We'll bring it back for next Monday. We'll be back on Thursday with a brand spanking new episode of our great show. CJ, get some good intel from those GM meetings, my man. Good luck to you this week.
Will do. And we had a tornado warning here this morning, so I'm just happy to say that
be safe.
That I'm safe. Everything looks good outside now, but I woke up to like one of those phone alerts, like, and it was a tornado warning, and it said stay away from glass and get to lower floors of your building. So I literally just went and hung out in the bathroom for like half an hour.
Oh my God. Oh,
well,
okay.
I don't even want to make light of it. I don't, because I don't know if anything happened.
I'm not making light of that either. That's holy crap. You're in the bathroom for 30 minutes?
Yeah, anyway, just hanging out because that was the interior part of my hotel room. And I was, anyway, everything's fine. The sun's out now, and it's a great place to be down in Florida for these meetings.
Yeah, looking forward to hearing more from your time in Florida. Thanks so much for everyone who tapped into today's show. We'll be back later this week. Peace.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.